My daughter is living with me this summer, working remotely while she makes a move from Denver to Chicago. So I drove out, and towing a small U-Haul behind my little SUV to get her here was just too much for my car's transmission. Thankfully, we made it into Springfield before it had to be completely rebuilt. So the shop had my car for a couple of weeks, and when I got it back, along with a bill for a few $1,000s, I discovered that I had been the victim of a very bizarre crime. Someone had taken absolutely everything from inside my car. Nothing of great value, but seriously, they got everything. The owner's manual, insurance cards, the warranty for my tires, an ice scraper, some copies of books that I wrote and which no one had bought. And so I hope they read them. They probably won't. No one else does. But the oddest thing that they took was one of the headrests off the back seat. My daughter felt terrible about my expensive repair that was caused by her move, but the theft was just one injustice too much for her. She demanded that the transmission shop owner reimburse me for the loss of my things from the car, because it was, after all, in his care. I kept trying to assure her that it was no big deal and that there was no way that the shop owner would take responsibility for those items, but she wouldn't hear it. So, even though I tried not to hear it, I overheard her conversation with the shop owner, who was telling her that he didn't feel responsible for the loss of this stuff. And suddenly, after her voice had risen to something of a Bruce Willis in a Die Hard movie level, she shouts, "This is elder abuse. My dad is a senior citizen, and he doesn't deserve this kind of treatment." Suddenly, the headrest and the umbrella took on an entirely different dimension. Her rage was not simply because my venial loss was unjust. It was because I, as a vulnerable senior citizen, was being abused. What is slightly even more painful is that this argument worked on the shop owner, who couldn't be much younger than I am. Now, I'll sometimes take advantage of a senior discount at a movie theater or a shop, but that's just a number. You know, if I can get 5 or 10% off, so much the better, and I don't really think about it. But realizing the larger truth, which is perhaps more factual than I care to acknowledge, is that I have quite accidentally become old. I didn't mean to, and it happened so gradual that unless I'm actually looking into a mirror, I still think of myself as that 35-year-old lion of the pulpit, ready to take on presidents and kings in pursuit of social justice, climate legislation, and a more just economy. But in truth, it has been years since I was a runner, and now I don't even walk very fast. I have such bad arthritis in my thumbs that it makes me hand a stubborn jar that needs to be opened to my daughter. I sometimes get dizzy when I stand up, and the guys that I play racquetball with often stop the game and ask, "Are you okay?" as if the big one was just right around the corner. I've been semi-retired for a couple of years, and at the end of this year, I will retire entirely. I'll likely move near the ocean somewhere in Florida where I can sit among my peers and criticize the government full time. I hope that I will occasionally get an invitation to preach or to add a video to our YouTube channel. I can't imagine the anxiety most of you must feel at the thought of being permanently deprived of knowing what my opinion is about virtually everything. Because before there was a Facebook or a Twitter, I understood that the whole world does have a right to my opinion, and I will continue to strive not to disappoint you. But we do live in a culture that worships youth. I was just a kid when I first read the quote from the former head of Revlon, where he said, "In the factory, we manufacture cosmetics, but in the store, we sell hope." When I was little, my mom was still in her 40s. She and most of the ladies at church dyed their hair. They wore not just makeup, but usually also wigs and hats and girdles to make themselves look younger. Now, science has cursed women with myriad expensive and frankly dangerous ways to deny the reality of their aging. And Botox injections have recently begun to be marketed to men as well. And I'm afraid it's not just Johnny Depp who wears eye makeup all the time. There is a none too subtle message in culture that your value as a person goes down precipitously with each birthday. But factually, I know a lot more than I knew when I was 35. In fact, a few years ago, I actually destroyed everything I had written before I was 50 years old because I'd never wanted anyone to see it. I'm well aware that employers, even churches, want to hire people in their 30s in spite of their ignorance and pompous self-confidence. We are a culture that prefers image over substance, and we are not alone in that. I've traveled a lot over the last few years, and I can tell you that plastic surgery is apparently more common in places like Thailand and Brazil than it is here in the United States. And as sad and pathetic as the desperation expressed in such measures can be, I think religion is even worse. How many funerals have you been to where the preacher makes promises about an imaginary world in which the deceased get new eyes and new ears, new legs and feet, no more disability, no more infirmity or disease? I'm just holding out to hear them tell me that in heaven, cheesecake isn't fattening. But I realize that my stark realism is sometimes painful for you to hear. But dear friends, mortality is a one-way ticket. Every cradle swings over a grave. And there is no surgery, there are no cosmetics, and there is no religion that can change the inevitable truth that life is short. And for those of us who are fortunate to have a longer rather than a shorter life, we live through loss of vitality, even if modern science can help us to maybe keep our teeth until we die. Our knees and our shoulders and our hands will wear out on our way to our final resting place. What I want to say today is that age isn't just an irrational robbery that takes things like good looks and athletic prowess away from us. Old age also has gifts to give if we are willing to receive them. There are things you can only learn through experience. In fact, there are things you can only learn through repeated failure. There is wisdom that can be mined from simply living for 20,000 days that you can't learn from Harvard or Yale. When he was 81 years old, the British philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote an essay entitled How to Grow Old. And he pointed out that getting older allowed us to transition into a time when we could increasingly let go of our ego. And it wasn't until I read Russell's essay that I was able to see how much competition had played a role in my entire career. There are none too subtle battles that go on within churches, especially among the clergy. We often call it steeple envy. When I was a pastor of a moderately sized church in Louisville, Kentucky, I had lots of friends in the clergy. Our families often took vacations together. There was a group of ministers I met with every Tuesday as we worked out our sermon outlines for that week together. We supported one another, we helped one another when we could, but the pastors of the largest churches in our denominations never attended those meetings, which made them fair game for our group gossip. In 1991, I was hired by the largest church of my denomination in the region, and I was only 34 years old. And I suddenly had no friends in the clergy. I realized that I then had become the topic of discussion in clergy gatherings. There was a solution to that, though. Our denomination, in their wisdom, organized an annual meeting for the 50 pastors of the largest congregations in the country. And I went to a few of those testosterone-driven meetings of almost exclusively tall white men, all eyeing the prospects of their next promotion. The Christian religion in those meetings had become something that was a far cry from the poor carpenter who died on a Roman cross that it claimed to associate itself with. From the time that I was a student minister in a little rural church in Kentucky until I was even called at one point to be the senior pastor of our denomination's national cathedral in Washington, D.C., the question we were confronted with every day was whether our attendance was going up or going down. I'm certain that this is not a disease known only to pastors. Whether you're the pastor of a cathedral or a manager of a Starbucks, the question of growth is where you are trained to derive your self-esteem. If you aren't doing better than your predecessor, if you aren't doing better than your peers, then somehow you are not a complete human being. If sales are less this month than they were last month, if average church attendance is less this year than it was last year, then you look forward to sleepless nights, antidepressants, antacid, and a lot of anxiety in your future. It's almost impossible even to be happy for one of your peers whose latest book is selling more copies than your latest book. And there has never been an actor born who had the strength to not read the critical reviews of their last play or their last movie. But age, especially in retirement, can give the gift of letting go of all of that. You don't have to beat anyone. You don't have to impress anyone. You don't have to be better than your rivals. And trust me, even if you are, you don't have to be more sexy than your younger competitors. Bertrand Russell says that you can let your ego diminish and allow the universe of your interests to expand. I don't have to always be focused on being the one who can tell the difference between something Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, or Plato actually said in some internet meme and what they did not. I can read a fiction novel just because I enjoy it, not because reading it will make me better informed or more culturally aware or loaded with powerful quotes for my next sermon. Every book I read doesn't have to have writing in the margins or dog-eared pages. You can go to your 50th high school reunion regardless of how much more of you there is under your belt or how little coverage you still have on top of your head. You should have been able to go to your 20th high school reunion without worrying about such things, but at least as a senior citizen, you should be able to let go of such concerns and simply be happy that you're one of the lucky ones who's still alive. When I was a puppy preacher, and I came to this town to be the senior pastor of a flagship church, I inherited a congregation with a lot of retired ministers in it. Most of them were kind and supportive, but a couple were so insanely jealous that they were always sniping at me whenever they could, being publicly critical and offering their unsolicited advice about what all I was doing wrong. One especially ego-deficit fellow sat in the balcony every week just shaking his head during each sermon, and at the end of the service he would slowly make his way down to the front and say, loudly enough for everyone to hear, a flattering compliment to the organist, and then turn to the soloist of the day and praise their work. And lastly, he always turned to me to explain to me why I was an idiot and everything that I said was wrong. Honestly, I can say in retrospect that some of his criticisms were spot on, and he was naming things that I really did need to reconsider or study or even learn how to pronounce. However, he delivered his predictable barbs in a way that really I couldn't change based on what he said, and they really just made me hate him a little bit more every week. He was one of the guys that Mark Twain must have had in mind when he said that he never actually wanted to kill anyone, but he had read certain obituaries with uncommon satisfaction. But advanced age can gift a person with wisdom, and if it does, it sure is nice when they learn how to pass it along in a way that can be digested. I was lucky enough to have a couple of those retired ministers as well. People who would say things like, you know, your message reminded me of this particular book. I have a copy if you'd like to read it. Or I would get a letter from them, and inside the letter would be a copy of an article or a poem that this wise mentor was suggesting might be something I would appreciate. And when delivered in that way, I think every single one of those articles and poems eventually became a sermon for me, because they were shared with me in a way that I could receive, that I could learn from, and that I could use. There's literally no telling how much good you can do if you can just get your own ego out of the way enough to teach without being condescending, to mix your correction with compliments, and to actually help someone rather than cutting them down to stroke your own ego. Next year, I will much more often be the retired pastor in the pew than I will be the preacher in the pulpit. And I am writing this message today as a reminder to myself to be the kind of retired pastor that I liked having in my congregation. And I hope that you can apply my observations to your own life situation, not just with churches or church folk, but with your own kids, with your grandchildren. Bertrand Russell said that when you are young, you're forced by your ego to inflate your own accomplishments and to strive to be a little better and a little better. But as we age, we should increasingly see ourselves not as an individual, but as a part of the whole of humanity, and to ask ourselves what we can do to lift the entire civilization. We have a lifetime of learning to share if we can just learn how to do it effectively. I'll close today with a confession because I think it's a teaching example. For the past several years, when I've been forced to take my car to the dealership, never like to do that, but when I have to, I have been shocked by both their incompetence and their indifference. And you know how it seems like now everyone sends you a survey whenever you've been somewhere? If they're asking me my opinion, and I'm a writer, I tell them in the most forceful way possible how deeply they disappointed me. They send out the forms and they ask, so I tell them. But I have not noticed any improvement in their service over the last 6 years. So I have lately decided to take a different tact with them. I watch for the employee who seems to be sincerely trying to be helpful, and I write to the management to compliment that employee. And in some cases where they've really gone out of their way to be helpful, I'll take a fruit basket or a box of chocolates a week or two later and give it to them and thank them in front of their peers and allow them to share their bounty with people who also could stand to be inspired to care a little more. Anger and gratitude are both rooted in the same insights about a shop's work. But gratitude makes me happier than anger does, and it appears to make the employees happier as well. I'm sorry that I had to be this many years old to realize this, but I hope that my sharing this may save some of you some time. Folks, growing older is unavoidable. Growing wiser, however, That's a choice, and you have to chase it.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.